Today, I want to talk about how to handle conflicts between your personal values. So, this can often feel like a moral failure. And moral failure is not always the result of a weakness or an incoherence in your personal value system. Very often, moral failure, it's a conflict between two values that both feel valid. And you choose loyalty and you compromise honesty, or you choose ambition and you compromise presence. You choose stability and you compromise growth. It doesn't feel like a mistake. It just feels like you're being pulled apart. And internal value conflict doesn't reflect ambivalence in your moral character or incoherence in your system. It reflects this structural absence where you have two principles that are issuing demands upon you without a mechanism to adjudicate them. And the contradiction between those things that you feel is real. The contradiction is real, and it doesn't resolve through your preferences or through achieving clarity alone. When your values collide, the result is not error, it's friction between obligations that both carry weight for you. The goal today, and what I want to talk about, isn't to resolve that conflict that you feel, it's to build a framework for living inside it without collapsing. So, there is a myth that you can have a full alignment across all the values in your personal value system. And the truth is, most people assume that if their values were properly clarified, that conflict would disappear. But that's a holdover from systems that demand purity, like religious or ideological or psychological systems. And the assumption is if you're still torn, then you must not have done the real work to build that value system, to build a consistent value system. But pluralism within your personal value system is not a failure, it's just reality. So, in usual fashion, I want to kind of draw from some ideas of the great thinkers to help us address this problem of what happens when our personal values collide. So, first of all, from Isaiah Berlin in his book, The Crooked Timber of Humanity. Berlin argues that many of our highest values are fundamentally incompatible: liberty and equality, justice and mercy, autonomy and belonging. Each one of these could be defended rationally, and each one might override the other depending on a context. The idea that they should all resolve into one coherent hierarchy for Berlin is a dangerous simplification where we actually don't get any of them, or we obfuscate the fact that there is trade-offs that we have to make in order to have all of them. So often, what we call moral clarity hides what we've chosen to ignore in the system in order to feel like we have a coherent personal value system, in order to feel like our values would never conflict with one another. So if two values matter deeply and genuinely, their collision actually won't be solved by analysis. It has to be carried with you. And we're going to dig more deeply into this. But every decision has a cost. And this is where we bring back in one of my favorite thinkers, William James, in his book, The Moral Equivalent of War, where James argues that moral progress depends on the ability to absorb and redirect our strongest energies, not to eliminate them. So the same instinct that drives conquest, empowered discipline, the same force behind domination can fuel courage. Values don't neutralize each other. They compete for expression in your life through your behavior. And that competition is constant. Most internal values and the conflicts that come up, those conflicts feel destabilizing because the person assumes that one side of that conflict must be wrong. So if I am trying to choose, for example, between feeling autonomous, meaning I'm self-governed, and feeling like I belong, which often being enmeshed in a community comes with obligations. So I have to, oh, okay, I have to choose between autonomy and belonging right now. You give yourself this ultimatum because you have a rigid ideologically framed personal value system, right? Like, but that destabilizing feeling doesn't have to occur. A better way to frame it, or a better question to bring to a personal values conflict, is what is the moral cost of choosing one over the other? And how often are you willing to pay it? If you're always choosing, for example, stability over truth, then what does that preserve exactly? Or what does that erode? And if you're constantly prioritize justice over empathy, then what kind of person are you reinforcing? What kind of identity are you designing for yourself? And these, as you know, these are not abstract dilemmas. These are dilemmas that are forged and enacted and realized through your decisions in real life. They are structural feedback loops. So every time one of your personal values wins, it strengthens its grip, its hold on your subconscious. Every time a value is sidelined, it weakens. And the system doesn't forget. It actually adapts each time you choose one value over another. So finally, I want to go into what are the limitations of integrating all of our values into a single system? Because I want us to be persuaded of how normal it is to have a pluralistic value system, meaning that they don't all have to cohere or exist in a linear hierarchy. This is the old framework. This is the old myth of personal values that I have to be able to look at it all at once. And doing so is like, it's like trying to look, if you go into outer space and you're like, I want to see the whole world at once. It's like, well, you're only going to see one side of it. You know, you're not going to see a map of the entire world. Your vantage point is always going to be limited by where you are, by your situation, by your location. So, Martha Nussbaum, she offers a different frame. In her work, Love's Knowledge, she explores the limits of procedural morality. Her argument is that literature, not philosophy, teaches us how values actually behave because only narrative can capture the nuance of context, motivation, and ambiguity. Moral conflict, in Nussbaum's view, isn't a bug in the system of rules. It's an expected consequence of life lived among competing goods. Competing goods is a key category for us to have. What Nussbaum adds is not relativism, but moral imagination. The ability to see that conflict is not resolved by abstract prioritization alone. It's resolved, when it is resolved, through careful attention to particulars, not by flattening the system out, but by understanding how one's obligations shift without being erased. This approach refuses a perfect system, but it builds coherence through response, not formula. So, this is how conflict between values manifests in real decisions. Value conflict rarely appears as a philosophical dilemma. It shows up as hesitation and reversal and ambivalence and rationalization and displacement and projection, as quiet erosion. It shows up as all of these um, things that are adjacent to direct communication. Like when two values generate legitimate but incompatible demands, right? What Nussbaum calls these competing goods, and the system lacks a rule for resolution, the agent, you, have to improvise. And what follows from that is not indecision, it's a structural breakdown. So it's actually just your code throwing a bug. So consider the following case. Like a person discovers that a close friend is about to make a serious mistake. Sharing the information would damage trust, but withholding it would violate a long held commitment to honesty. So the system recognizes both values, right? A person discovers that a friend, close friend's about to make a serious mistake. Do I breach this threshold of honesty, right? And in doing so, do I damage the trust that I have with this person? So the system recognizes both of these values, but has no way to resolve them. And the problem, see, values are meant to abstract and create for us like a microcosm of what we would do in every conceivable situation. And the problem is if you create too many rules and too many decision branches, you end up creating a map the size of the world, right? Where the scale is one. And and so what you want to do is you want to keep your value system as compact as possible, but also have rules for adapting it to various kinds of situations. So here are the different ways that these value conflicts can show up and how they manifest in real decisions, and some ways to kind of address or resolve them. So the first is that you have competing priorities, and we've already talked about this. Competing priorities is when you have two values that issue incompatible demands on you. One has to be deferred, neither is structurally ranked. So, in our situation, in our moral example, where we learn that somebody is about to make a serious mistake, and the question is, do we breach our value of honesty in order to help this person in a way that might violate our relationship with them, right? So, um, let's say that the person says nothing and they feel guilt and they feel instability, not because the decision was ethically flawed, but because the system provided no basis for prioritization. So what you do is you choose the trust and safety of the relationship, and you don't choose or prioritize or realize or manifest or enact your value of honesty, right? So the philosophical anchor here would be Isaiah Berlin's account of pluralism, where he explains this as a clash between incommensurable goods. The goal is not to reconcile, but to choose under pressure without pretending that the choice was clean. So in that case, were you right or were you wrong to choose what you did? Again, this is a matter of your personal values. And in that case, your personal values didn't dictate one over the other. So you have to let yourself off the hook if the consequences of that decision don't end up the way that you imagined, or end up, or in retrospect, you feel like you wish you could go back and make a different decision. This is all an opportunity for learning, and ultimately, this will feed back into your value system, right? If you choose a specific value priority in the case where your value system doesn't clearly explain which value you should prioritize, and it ends up feeling like the wrong decision too late, you can use that as feedback back into your value system to revise and implement a rule there. So, first way that values conflict shows up in your actual decision making is competing priorities. The second way is moral overcompensation. Moral overcompensation is when, after deferring one value repeatedly, the agent or you swings hard in the opposite direction. This is very common. So, in our example of learning about a friend who's about to make a mistake and saying, do I kind of choose the relationship or do I choose my value of honesty? The person so let's say that you abruptly disclose everything without regard for timing or tone, right? Because you just let it build up and build up and build up, and finally you're like, I just have to tell somebody. That action isn't guided by deliberation. It's an attempt to resolve an internal tension. So in this case, we might take like what William James was talking about with moral energy and redirecting negative moral energy into positive moral decisions. James saw that moral energy as persistent. So this was more of a matter of poor energy management. So suppressed commitments reassert themselves elsewhere, often with disproportionate force. So again, we're going through a list of ways that more values conflict shows up in our personal decision making. First was competing priorities. The second is moral overcompensation. The third is narrative revision. So narrative revision is when the conflict between your personal values is reframed retrospectively to appear consistent. So you might say something like, yeah, I waited to tell them because I didn't want to hurt them. So the explanation conceals the conflict and replaces it with coherence, where it's, oh, it was all strategic, right? There was never a conflict between my values. I had a plan all along, right? Or to pretend like to make a decision, to make a priority, like to choose a specific priority, and then to look back and just pretend that you always had a reasoning there when you didn't. So the philosophical anchor here would be Martha Nussbaum, where she treats narrative as the form moral reasoning takes. So when the story simplifies, it often masks where the decision failed. So it's important when our personal values are in conflict that we're telling an accurate story about where they conflict, how they conflict, and we're not going back and doing rewrites of that story after the fact. Another way that value conflict arises in our decision making is via external proxy. What is external proxy? Well, external proxy is when responsibility is shifted to circumstance to avoid internal arbitration. So with our friend, we say they weren't ready to hear it. They just weren't ready to hear it. Right? So the conflict between your values actually remains unaddressed, but the decision is reframed as contextually constrained. Doesn't matter what my personal values are in terms of honesty versus the relationship, they're not ready to hear it anyway. So you use external proxy. So the philosophical answer here would be philosopher we haven't mentioned here, but we have elsewhere, Christine Korsgaard, where she emphasizes that moral obligation originates in the structure of agency. So external discomfort does not remove the burden of justification. So we kind of abdicate that burden. And then finally, a way that conflict in personal values shows up in decision making is abandonment disguised as resolution. So abandonment disguised as resolution is where one value is actually just silently removed from the system without acknowledgement or without revision. So let's say that you just say you withhold the truth and you later claim that honesty was never central to the relationship, right? The value isn't re-ranked, it's erased. And the philosophical anchor here would be something like Elizabeth Anscombe, who would treat this as a breakdown of moral intelligibility. So when values can disappear without consequence, the system loses coherence and ceases to function as a structure of judgment. So again, poor ways that we manage the conflict between personal values and decision making is we have these competing priorities. We have moral overcompensation, narrative revision, external proxy, and abandonment disguised as resolution. So each of these responses is a symptom of missing architecture. They're not signs of weakness or dishonesty. They're just the natural result of holding multiple values in a system that cannot rank or constrain or reconcile them under real conditions. So the function of a value system is this. A value system that cannot tolerate internal conflict will collapse or become rigid. And either way, it stops functioning. Real moral agency begins where full alignment ends. The test of a value system is not whether it removes contradiction from your life. It's whether it can withstand contradiction without disintegrating. Pluralism emerges when values operate beyond scripts or identity or approval. It's the presence of pluralism in your personal value system signals moral seriousness, not indecision, and these value conflicts are a part of having a serious personal value system. Very easy to internalize the experience of having our personal values conflict and internalize that as incoherence or guilt or shame, and to moralize the oscillation that occurs when we feel we are constantly violating our moral values. And if we don't understand that personal values are meant to be polymorphic and pluralistic and diverse and not fully integrated into a single cohesive whole in order to be adaptable to life, then when we view our personal value system as diverse fundamentally, then we don't place the label of incoherence on it, but rather have being multi-purposeful, then we spare ourselves a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. Because the truth is, every single moral decision that you make, every decision you make based on your personal values, is going to be a trade-off, is going to be a bit of a conflict. And so if you're chronically feeling this low-level guilt or shame or moral inadequacy because you're always like feeling like you're doing something wrong, this is a sign that you can actually you don't have to change your values at all. You may not even have to change your behavior at all. You may just have to change your frame of mind about what personal values are to understand that your personal values are always in competition. You always have competing goods that are requiring divergent behavior paths from you, and you're always choosing one over another. You're having moral FOMO in a way. And this doesn't mean that you're wrong for choosing one over the other. But the fact is, there's always a different way to do things. And that different way to do things is also in alignment with your value. And you're not betraying other values in your life by choosing one or another. You're simply enacting a personal value system in the only way that it can be implemented, which is as a decision for making trade-offs. Because the truth is, you can only live one life. And a personal value system is a way of guiding you through that linear path in life. It's a way of helping you rationalize and internalize and live authentically a single path. And very often we moralize or guilt or shame ourselves when we look at alternative paths that we could have taken. Say, oh, I should have done that. I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm doing this. I shouldn't be here. I should be there. Right? It's like, no, you're here for a reason. And if you need to change, then you can do that work on a personal values level and you can reorient, and that's fine. But recognize that you're never going to achieve a life that feels fully in aligned, that is not constituted by trade-offs, other personal values that are also good, that you also hold on to and also continue to value, right? All your values are meant to support you in different contexts and different places. And they're all going to have a seat at the table and voice their concerns in each situation, but it's impossible to honor them all in every situation. So once you understand that, then you can have a little bit more peace about the life path you choose, about the decisions you make, about the trade-offs you make, and understand that there's no such thing as another world where you make a trade-off and it doesn't feel like a trade-off, or you don't have to think of it as a trade-off, right? That's like the moral grass is greener perspective. And that's just not an accurate way to look at it. What you should do is say, like, for example, people often do this in life. You know, a big example is kids, right? Where people say, oh, I don't want to have kids because I don't want to regret having kids. It's like, well, you know, don't not have kids because you think that you might regret it, because not having kids is also a life that many people often regret. Right? So you're like, don't choose a life path just because you feel like you're going to avoid regret, like one way or another. Like, you're gonna miss out on something. Trade-offs will always bring regret. Everybody, this is something I'm learning. Everybody dies with regret. And I'm not saying everybody dies badly or dies with, you know, like deep, sickening regrets that cause them deep emotional pain, but everybody dies with all of the all of the alternative lives they could have lived inside of them, and all of the all of the dreams they could have manifested. And what they had in life was the result of the trade-offs they were willing, right? And those trade-offs were either worth it to you or they weren't. And the only way you know if they were worth it to you or they weren't is if when you made the decision to pursue them, they were an expression of and in alignment with your personal values, and they were the personal values you chose. So we have to make those decisions in real time. We have to make those decisions concretely in life. We can't avoid them. We can't just make them in theory. But pluralism emerges when values operate beyond the scripts level of identity or approval. The presence of pluralism in your life, it signals a moral seriousness about your life, not an indecision. So I'm just wanting to offer that shift in frame of mind for you, that a system capable of surviving pressure must be able to absorb incompatible truths without collapsing into false coherence.